At 45, I had finally learned how to make my peace with a stone floor. I had spent 5 years in the parish workhouse, scrubbing the grease from other people's linen, counting the days until the damp finally took my lungs and ended the argument. I didn't pray for a rescue. When your family is ruined, and the only man you ever loved has been dead to you for 20 years, you stop looking at the gate. You simply work until your hands go numb. But then the iron gate rattled open, and my 18-year-old niece stood there, her face white with a shock that reached straight into my quiet and broke it in two. "Aunt Amabel," she whispered, and her voice was shaking so hard the words almost fell apart. "He has bought the ledger. He paid the parish debt to the last farthing. He is waiting outside." I didn't drop the lye soap. I didn't faint, and I didn't weep. I was 45 years old, and I had left my tears in the orchard 20 years ago. I simply looked down at my raw fingers and forced my heart to go perfectly still. "Which he, Cressida?" I asked. My voice came out flat, level, like a clerk reading a death notice. "The world is full of wealthy men with nothing better to do than buy up old debts. You will have to be more specific." "The Marquess," she said, stepping closer, holding out a piece of parchment like it was a knife. "The new one. Lord Gideon. He has come back from the northern campaigns. They say he has more gold than the king and a temper like iron. Aunt, he didn't just pay the debt. He bought your release. He is waiting in the carriage." At 45, I had finally learned how to make my peace with a stone floor. I had spent 5 long years in the parish workhouse, scrubbing the grease from other people's linen, counting the days until the damp finally took my lungs and ended the argument. I didn't pray for a rescue. When your family is ruined and the only man you ever loved has been dead to you for 20 years, you stop looking at the gate. You simply work until your hands go numb. The gray soapy water splashed over the sides of the wooden tub, stinging the raw, cracked skin of my knuckles, but I did not stop. In the workhouse, to pause was to invite the overseer's eye, and I had kept my pride intact by giving them no reason to look at me. But then the iron gate rattled open, a harsh, scraping sound that cut through the heavy drone of the laundry yard. My 18-year-old niece stood in the archway, her bonnet askew from running across the muddy parish lanes, her face white with a shock that reached straight into my quiet and broke it clean in two. "Aunt Amabel," she whispered, breathing so hard the words almost fell apart before they could reach me. She clutched her threadbare shawl to her chest. "He has bought the ledger. He paid the parish debt to the last farthing. He is waiting outside." I did not drop the heavy block of lye soap, and I did not faint, and I did not weep. I was 45 years old, and I had left my tears in an orchard a lifetime ago. I simply looked down at my wet fingers and forced my heart to go perfectly still, listening to the drip of the water against the flagstones. "Which he, Cressida?" I asked. My voice came out flat, level, surprising me with its emptiness. "The world is full of wealthy men with nothing better to do than buy up old debts to clear their consciences. You will have to be more specific." "The Marquess," she said, stepping into the damp yard, holding out a crumpled piece of parish parchment like it was a knife. "The new one, Lord Gideon. He has come back from the northern campaigns, Aunt. They say the old Marquess died in the winter, and the brother shortly after, and the title has fallen straight to a soldier who was never meant to have it. He has more gold than the king and a temper like iron. He didn't just pay the debt, he signed your release. His carriage is at the gate." 1 second. 2. 3. The world shifted its weight, but I refused to fall. Gideon Vance, come back. Gideon, who had taken every bright promise of my youth, packed it into a soldier's kit, and vanished into the smoke of a distant war, without ever looking back. For 20 years, I had believed him faithless. I had watched my father's optimism ruin our estate, watched our name drag through the mud, and eventually, when the money ran dry, I had walked through these workhouse gates because the alternative was a forced marriage to a man I despised. I had chosen the stone floor over a lie. And now, the man who had abandoned me was standing on the other side of the wall, holding the key to my cage. Gather your things, Aunt, Cressida pleaded, her young eyes wide with a romantic fantasy she was too innocent to understand. You are free. No one is ever free, child, I said quietly, wiping the gray soap from my arms with a coarse apron. They merely change masters. I walked out of the laundry yard without looking back at the tubs. I did not possess a cloak, nor an extra gown, nor a single token of the life I had lost. I had only my pride, and the heavy, unspent anger that had kept me warm through 5 bitter winters. As I walked down the narrow stone corridor toward the heavy oak doors, the overseer did not speak to me. He merely watched, with a sullen, defeated look, holding the ledger that bore the fresh, dark ink of a Marquess's signature. The doors groaned open, letting in the sharp, cold air of a northern autumn. A grand carriage sat in the gravel lane, its varnished panels gleaming against the gray sky, black horses stamping their hooves in the mud. The door of the carriage was already open, held by a footman in fine livery, who did not look me in the eye. I stepped into the lane, my old boots squelching in the mire, and looked inside the carriage. There, sitting in the shadows, was a man built of straight lines and hard edges. He was broader than the boy I remembered, his chestnut hair touched with silver at the temples, a severe soldier's stillness settling over a face weathered by wind and gunpowder. But the gray eyes were identical. They found me where I stood in my coarse workhouse dress, an aging woman with rough hands and a lifted chin. He did not smile, and he did not reach out. He merely stared at the wreckage the years had made of me, his jaw tightening into a hard, unreadable knot. "Get in, Amabel," Gideon said, and the low, gravelly resonance of his voice struck the old lock of my heart like a blow. "We have a great deal of arithmetic to settle." The heavy door of the carriage clicked shut behind me, sealing out the damp stench of the workhouse yard and replacing it with the scent of polished leather, cedar, and old rain. The silence inside was thick, almost suffocating. For 5 years my world had been a chorus of clinking washtubs, coughing women, and the harsh commands of the overseer. This quiet felt like a trap. I did not sit back against the plush velvet cushions. To lean back would be to accept the comfort of a man I still believed had cast me aside when the world grew dark. Instead, I sat on the very edge of the seat, my spine straight, my coarse, damp workhouse dress a stark, ugly smudge against the immaculate interior of the carriage. Gideon did not look at me at first. He kept his eyes fixed on the window as the horses jerked forward, the iron-rimmed wheels crunching over the gravel lane. The gray light of the autumn afternoon caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the deep lines etched around his mouth that had not been there when he was 24. He looked like a man who had spent 2 decades deciding who lived and who died in the mud. And the heavy signet ring of the Marquess of Malmesbury looked entirely foreign on his scarred, weather-beaten hand. "You have kept your chin up, I see," he said, his voice cutting through the rumble of the wheels. He still did not turn his head. "The overseer told me you were the only soul in the place who never begged for an extra ration of bread or an extra blanket when the frost hit. I told him he didn't know you. I do not beg for what is mine by right, and I certainly do not beg from men who trade in human misery," I answered, my voice steady, though my blood ran hot. "And I did not ask for your charity today, Lord Malmesbury. If I am to be a debtor, I would prefer to owe the parish than a ghost." At that, he finally turned. The gray eyes narrowed, flashing with a sudden, dangerous heat that made him look less like a peer of the realm and more like the reckless soldier who had survived the northern campaigns. "Charity?" He let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded like a bark. "Is that what you call this, Amabel? You think I spent 3 days tracing your name through the parish ledgers out of a sense of benevolence? You think I care about the few £100 your father's collapse left behind? Then why am I in this carriage?" I demanded, leaning forward, the raw skin of my knuckles tightening. "If it is not a rescue, then what is it? A display of your consequence. To show the plain gentry girl who stayed behind that the penniless younger son came home with enough gold to buy her out of a cage." Gideon leaned closer, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the small space between us. The scent of gunpowder and winter air seemed to cling to his heavy wool coat. "I bought your ledger because the arithmetic did not balance," he said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing whisper. "For 20 years, I lived in a tent believing you had thrown me over for a man with substance. I believed you took one look at my empty pockets and chose security. I carried that stone in my chest through every battle I fought. And then I come home to find the brother and father who stood between me and this title are dead. And the girl who supposedly traded me for a grand estate is scrubbing stone floors in a parish workhouse." He reached out, his hand pausing in the air between us for a fraction of a second before he gripped the rough fabric of my sleeve, pulling me just an inch closer. "A woman who breaks a vow for money does not end up in a debtor's prison, Amabel," Gideon growled, his jaw rigid. "The math does not come out. And I am going to find out which one of us is the fool and who wrote the letters that tore the world apart." The carriage lurched violently as we hit the main turnpike, the horses gathering speed, carrying us away from the only peace I had known and toward the suffocating grandeur of his ancestral estate. The carriage reeled into the iron gates of Malmesbury Park just as the last of the gray daylight died behind the hills. I did not look out the window at the sprawling, neglected acreage, nor at the towering stone facade of the great house that sat like a tomb in the dark. My eyes were fixed entirely on the small leather case resting at Gideon's boots, a simple, battered officer's trunk that looked absurdly out of place beneath the gold leaf molding of his new carriage. It was the only thing in this entire display of sudden wealth that belonged to the man I had known. When the horses came to a sharp halt, the footman opened the door, but Gideon held up a single scarred hand, dismissing the servant with a short nod. He didn't move to get out. The carriage grew cold as the northern wind rushed through the open door, but the silence between us remained suffocatingly hot. "You will stay in the West Wing," Gideon said, his tone shifting back into that flat, military command that left no room for argument. "My aunt's old rooms have been cleared. They are dry and they are warm. Tomorrow, the estate books will be brought to you." I let out a cold, sharp breath that misted in the dark space between us. "The estate books? You paid my parish debts to turn me into a clerk, Lord Malmesbury. I am a ruined gentleman's daughter who has spent 5 years laundry deep in lie. My hands are too stiff for fine script, and my mind has no patience for your balances. Your mind is the only one in this county that isn't trying to rob me blind," Gideon countered, finally looking me dead in the eye. The severity of his gaze was unyielding. "The late Marquess let the land agent run this place into the dirt while he drank himself into an early grave. The tenants are starving, the roofs are failing, and my cousin Perry is already measuring the rooms for his own furniture, waiting for me to slip up. I need someone who knows how to spot a thief on paper. You did it for your father until his optimism overrode your ledger. You will do it for me." "And if I refuse?" I asked, my chin lifting in defiance against the plush velvet backdrop. "If I choose to walk back those 4 miles of mud to the workhouse gate?" "You won't," Gideon said softly, and for the first time, a terrible, heavy grief leaked through his soldier's armor. "Because you want to know who signed the lie just as badly as I do. You want to know who took a wet fortnight 20 years ago and used it to murder the 2 people we used to be." He stood up, his massive frame forcing me to step out into the gravel lane just to find room to breathe. He didn't offer his hand as I descended into the cold night. He simply walked ahead of me up the grand stone steps of the house, his heavy boots echoing against the terrace like a drumbeat. As the massive oak front doors swung open, revealing a vast, echoing hall draped in dust sheets and illuminated by a single flickering chandelier, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. A woman with a beautifully sharp, discontented face stood looking down at us, her silk skirts rustling like dry leaves. It was my sister, Sibylla. She had not come to the workhouse to look at me in 5 years, but she was here now, her eyes widening with a sudden, toxic panic as she saw the workhouse prisoner standing in the Marquess's hall. Sibylla did not descend the grand staircase. She waited at the landing like a queen holding a breached wall. Her beautiful, discontented face had gone entirely rigid. Her fingers clutching the polished mahogany railing so tightly, her knuckles showed white beneath her pale skin. 20 years of a cold, wealthy marriage to Lord Hesketh had frozen her youthful radiance into something sharp and brittle. But the look in her eyes as she stared down at my coarse workhouse dress was not disgust. It was a sudden, naked terror. "Gideon," she said, her voice carrying that perfect melodic pitch that had always made her passive-aggressive barbs sound like sweetness to the casual listener. "What is the meaning of this? The servants are already talking. You cannot possibly mean to house a common parish laborer in the West Wing. Think of the family's consequence. Think of Cressida." Gideon paused at the base of the stairs, his soldier's stillness settling over him like iron armor. He did not look up at her. He slowly unbuttoned his heavy wool coat, his severe gray eyes fixed on the flickering chandelier above us. "Your sister is not a parish laborer, Lady Hesketh," Gideon said, his low, gravelly resonance echoing off the damp stone walls of the hall. "She is the newly appointed mistress of my estate ledgers. Her grandfather's name is on half the deeds in this county, and her mind is the only one I trust to find the thieves currently bleeding this dukedom dry. As for the servants, they will learn to obey the guest I bring to my own door, or they will find themselves on the turnpike by morning." Sybilla's jaw tightened, a bitter little flicker of satisfaction rolling through me as I watched her take the hit. She turned her sharp gaze to me, her lips curling into a pitying, pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Amabel, dearest," she murmured, smoothing her silk skirts as she finally took 2 slow steps down. "Of course, we are all profoundly glad to see you out of that dreadful place. But you must see how this looks. An aging, portionless spinster staying under the roof of an unmarried Marquess. The county is already laughing at Gideon's sudden elevation. They will say you have used an old childhood acquaintance to trap a man who has gone soft in the head from foreign wars." I lifted my chin, refusing to perform for her or society's expectations. I let her take in the full sight of my rough, chapped hands and my stained apron. "The county may say whatever pleases its arithmetic, Sybylla," I answered, my voice flat, level, and entirely devoid of the deference she expected. "I have spent 5 years scrubbing stone floors. I am far past the age of arranging my face or my reputation for the comfort of country drawing rooms. I am here to balance a ledger, not to play the ghost of a girl you forgot the moment the money ran dry." Sybylla opened her mouth to deliver another smooth cruelty, but the rustle of lighter silk cut through the tension. My niece, Cressida, appeared from the shadow of the drawing-room door, her bright, youthful face flushed with a mixture of intense excitement and deep anxiety as she looked between us. "Mother, please," Cressida whispered, with an instinctive maternal protection that she had never received from her own cold mother. She didn't care about the workhouse grease. She reached out and took my raw hand in her warm ones. "Aunt Amabel is shivering. Let me take her to the West Wing. The fires are already lit." Sybylla watched her daughter defend the sister she had spent 20 years trying to bury, and a look of such profound, poisonous envy crossed her face that the draft in the hall seemed to turn to ice. She did not speak another word as Cressida led me away. But as we turned the corner into the long, dark corridor, I looked back. Gideon was still standing at the base of the stairs, watching Sybilla's retreating shadow with the flat, dangerous assessment of a military officer who had just spotted an enemy movement on his flank. The estate room in the West Wing smelled of old parchment, cold ink, and the bitter dust of decades. By the 3rd week, mountain of leather-bound ledgers had been sorted into neat, defensive rows across the massive oak desk. For 5 hours every morning, Gideon and I sat on opposite sides of that desk, the silence broken only by the scratching of my quill and the crackle of the hearth. It was the most exhausting work of my life, not because of the numbers, but because every line we tracked through the mud of his brother's neglect felt like walking the edge of a deep, unsaid country. We both kept our eyes on the pages, terrified of what would happen if we looked up. The work itself forced the first true alignment between us, driven not by sentiment, but by a shared hatred for a thief. Mr. Vance, Gideon's smooth, haughty cousin Peregrine, had arrived that morning under the pretense of offering family counsel. Instead, he stood by the window, idly swirling a glass of Canary wine, watching us with a thinly veiled contempt. Beside him stood the estate land agent, Mr. Throssell, a soft, heavily perfumed man who had grown remarkably fat while the tenants in the northern valley starved. "It is merely a matter of stand practice, my lord," Throssell said, offering a oily, practiced bow toward Gideon. He pointed a stubby, manicured finger at a ledger line. "The tenants at Low Barrow are 3 seasons deep in arrears. The late Marquess always signed the eviction notices before the quarter day. It is a simple formality. If you will just append your seal here." I set my quill down. The dark ink splattered slightly on the desk, and the entire room went perfectly still. "The tenants at Low Barrow are not in arrears because they are idle, Lord Malmesbury," I said, my voice carrying the flat, level certainty I had honed over 5 years of watching parish ruthlessness. "The main drainage dike broke during the spring thaw because this office neglected to clear the sluice gates. The land was under 4 feet of water for 2 months. The farmers lost their entire first sowing, yet according to these books, Mr. Throssell charged this estate £60 for sluice repairs 3 years running." Peregrine let out a soft, mocking chuckle from the window. "Come now, Amabel. A workhouse clerk can hardly understand the complex arithmetic of a grand estate. Throssell has managed these lands for a decade." "Then Throssell has been robbing this house for a decade," I countered, standing up, my rough hands resting flat against the oak desk. As I looked directly at Gideon, "I walked past Low Barrow on Tuesday with Cressida. There are no new sluice gates. The timber is rotten, the ironwork is rusted through, and the widow Miller is currently trying to feed 4 children on a flooded patch of clay. If you sign that notice, you are turning out the most industrious tenant on your northern flank, based on the word of a man whose own accounts show a deficit of £400 in timber sales." Throssell's oily complexion drained instantly, then flooded a deep, furious purple. "This is an outrage. My lord, I will not have my honor questioned by a—" Gideon held up a single, scarred hand. He didn't raise his voice, but the flat, dangerous assessment in his gray eyes silenced the land agent mid-sentence. He sat back in his chair, staring at Throssell, with the terrifying, unblinking focus of a commander evaluating a traitor before a firing squad. "You will bring me the receipts for the timber sales before noon tomorrow, Mr. Throssell," Gideon said, his low, gravelly whisper cutting through the cold room like a blade. "And you will bring the maintenance logs for the Low Barrow dike since the years 18 and 12. If a single nail is missing from the accounting, you will not be resigning your post. You will be answering to the magistrate." The land agent stumbled backward, his soft hands shaking as he gathered his hat and practically fled the room. Peregrine watched him go, his polished veneer of aristocratic courtesy cracking just enough to show the deep, ugly anxiety underneath. He set his wineglass down with a sharp click and left without saying goodbye. When the heavy door clicked shut, the room returned to its thick, echoing silence. I began to gather my papers, my fingers trembling slightly from the adrenaline, when Gideon's voice broke the quiet. "You saw his flank before I did," he said softly. I paused, looking across the desk. The severe lines of his face had softened into something new. Something that looked dangerously like the reverence he used to hold for me under the orchard trees. "I have lived among these ruined people for 5 years while you were away winning your grand battles, Lord Malmesbury," I answered, forcing my voice to remain steady as I gripped the edges of the ledger. Someone had to stay behind and mind the ground. The autumn wind tore across the ridge, carrying the scent of incoming rain from the northern hills. We had ridden out to the far boundary of Low Barrow to inspect the broken sluice gates ourselves, she on a quiet estate cob, and he on a massive black horse that looked as untamed as its master. The business had taken an hour, settled with a few sharp commands from Gideon to the remaining tenants. Now we were turning back through a narrow lane buried deep in gold. Dying leaves, the horses walking side by side in a heavy, aching silence. Gideon kept his eyes on the path ahead, his large hands steady on the reins, though his jaw was set with the rigid tension of a man probing an old, unhealed wound. "You never married, then?" he said, his gravelly voice dropping so low it was almost swallowed by the rustle of the canopy. It was not a casual inquiry, it was a demand for an accounting. My cousin Peregrine wrote to me in Spain during the second year of the campaign. He told me it was settled, that your family had pressed you toward a match of substance to save your father's credit, and that you had agreed. I drew my reins tight. The cob came to a sharp halt, the iron shoes crunching into the wet earth. Gideon's horse stopped a pace ahead, turning its great head as its master looked back at me across the narrow, gold-lit space. A frown gathered between my brows, my chest tightening with a sudden, suffocating heat. "Settled by whom?" I demanded, my voice low but striking the quiet air like a whip. "Was never to be married, Lord Malmesbury. Not that year, nor any year since. There was no match. There was no other man. There was nothing but a mountain of debt, a father who died of a broken heart, and a parish workhouse that took what was left. And after the letter I received from you, I had no stomach to look at another face, let alone a marriage bed." Gideon went perfectly still in the saddle. It was that terrifying soldier's stillness, the absolute freeze of a commander who has just heard the ground shift beneath a position he has defended for 20 years. "From me?" he repeated, his gray eyes narrowing until they looked like chipped flint. "What letter, Amabel? The one written in your hand," I said, my voice trembling now, the defensive armor I had worn for 2 decades beginning to crack and bleed. "The kind, civil letter that released me from my promise because the northern campaigns had altered your heart. You told me you had formed an attachment to another, the daughter of a fellow officer in your regiment. You begged me to forget you and find my own happiness. I have it still, God help me. It is the only thing I took with me to the workhouse floor. I have read the ink off the page for 20 winters." "I never wrote it," Gideon growled. The words left his throat like a curse, raw and furious. "There was no officer's daughter. There was never anyone else. For 20 years, there has been no one but—" He bit off the sentence, his chest heaving beneath his heavy wool coat. He swung down from his horse with a reckless agility that belonged to his youth, the black beast stamping its hooves as Gideon strode across the gold leaves to the side of my cob. He reached up, his scarred hands gripping the leather of my reins, his face pale beneath the weathered bronze. "Amabel, listen to me," he said, his voice cracking with a terrifying, unspent grief. "I stopped writing because I received a letter from you. It was your script, your signature. It told me you had thought better of a poor soldier's uncertain prospects. You begged me to release you so your family could secure a match with a gentleman of wealth. I folded that page until it tore, and I put it in my breast pocket before every breach I charged. I rose through the ranks because I didn't care if I lived to see the morning. I spent 20 years believing the steadiest girl in the north had traded me for a grand house." The lane seemed to tilt beneath the gray sky. The gold leaves came down around us, turning in the damp air, and neither of us watched them fall. "I would have cut off my hand before I wrote such a thing," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over my slashes, hot and unbidden, burning my cold cheeks. "Gideon!" I waited. Until the bailiffs took the chairs from beneath me, I waited. "If you did not write your release, and I did not write mine," Gideon said, his fingers tightening on the leather until the iron buckles groaned, "then whose hand signed the page?" And there it lay between us in the cold mud of the lane, the monstrous, undeniable truth. We had both been faithful. Neither had abandoned the other. A malicious ghost had reached across a war with 2 forged hands to steal 20 years from 2 people who had never, for a single hour, stopped being true. The storm broke over the slate roofs of Malmesbury Park that same night, rattling the high sash windows of the estate room. I sat alone under the flickering candle glow, my hands trembling so violently I could no longer hold the quill to track the timber receipts. The revelation from the autumn lane hung in the dark corners of the room like a physical weight. 20 years. We had traded 20 years of a shared life for 2 sheets of lying parchment. The heavy oak door swung open with a sharp, aggressive click, and Peregrine stepped into the room. He had discarded his polished society smile. His hair was damp from the rain, his coat slightly disheveled, and his eyes held the desperate, glittering look of a gambler who had just seen the cards turn against him. "Still working, Amabel?" he asked, his tone dropping the thin veneer of cousinly courtesy, revealing a sharp, aristocratic edge. He strode to the edge of the desk, leaning down until his shadow completely swallowed my ledger. "You should be packing your meager things instead. I have just come from a long discussion with the estate trustees. A Marquess cannot have a disgraced workhouse pauper managing his books, let alone lingering in his West Wing. It is an insult to the family name." I did not flinch, nor did I shrink back from him. I closed the heavy leather ledger with a deliberate, echoing thud. "The family name was dragged through the mud long before I entered these doors, Peregrine," I said, my voice flat, level, and ringing with a dangerous clarity. "And if the trustees are concerned with insults, perhaps they should look at the £400 currently missing from the timber accounts. Accounts that bear your personal signature as an overseer during the late Marquess's illness." Peregrine's face flushed a dark, furious crimson, his fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany desk until his knuckles cracked. "You think you are clever, don't you? You think because Gideon brought you out of the ditch, you have a claim here. But he is a Marquess now. He needs an heir to secure the succession, a young woman of birth and fortune to wipe away the taint of his years in the mud. He needs what you can never give him. You are an aging, portionless spinster, Amabel. You are a ghost he paid a few pounds to dismiss. If he marries you, the county will tear him apart, and I will ensure the courts question his sanity. He will not have to marry anyone to please you, Perry." A low, gravelly voice growled from the threshold. Gideon stood in the doorway, his massive frame dripping with rainwater, his severe gray eyes fixed on his cousin with the terrifying stillness of a soldier preparing for a breach. He had just returned from the northern boundary cottages, his boots caked in clay, but he carried himself with an absolute, unyielding authority. Peregrine spun around, his polished composure shattering completely. "Gideon, I was merely explaining to her the realities of your position. The succession is my affair." Gideon intercepted, walking slowly into the room, his heavy steps echoing against the floorboards like a drumbeat. He stopped less than an inch from his cousin, forcing Peregrine to step back. "And my position is quite clear. Tonight, while you were drinking my wine and threatening my guest, I was at the tenant cottages. I watched Amabel calmly tend to a fever-stricken child, and set the winter rations for 3 families, while the land agent's books were still in chaos. She has more dignity, more wit, and more genuine competency in her stained apron than you and the entire county assembly possess, combined." Gideon turned his head slightly, his gaze finding mine across the candlelit desk. The hardness in his jaw didn't soften, but the gray eyes held a fierce, unbreakable promise that left me breathless. "I did not survive 20 winters of war to let a country drawing room dictate my life, Perry," Gideon whispered, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind outside. "I am marrying the woman who kept the ground, and if you or the trustees speak another word against her, I will dismantle this inheritance piece by piece until you have nothing left to inherit but the dirt." The storm died by morning, leaving the West Wing enveloped in a thick, freezing fog that pressed against the windows like a shroud. I was at the desk, mechanically organizing the final ledger balances, when the door burst open. Cressida slipped into the room, her eyes wide and wet with tears, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She did not speak. She simply hurried to the desk and dropped a small, faded leather writing folio onto the open pages of my ledger. "I found it, Aunt," Cressida whispered, her voice trembling as she backed away, looking at the folio as if it were a nesting viper. In the hidden drawer of the morning room desk, the desk that belonged to my mother before she married my father. My breath caught in my throat. I unclasped the brass latch of the folio. Inside were dozens of scraps of old parchment, covered in a single hand that had spent hours, days, practicing. On one scrap was my signature, copied over and over until the slant matched perfectly. On another was Gideon's name, drafted in an elegant, sweeping script that looked exactly like the letter I had kept in my pocket for 20 winters. And beneath them lay the original, unsent letters we had written to each other as young lovers. The letters that had never reached their destinations. Sibylla. It had always been Sibylla, driven by a youthful, poisonous jealousy because the penniless younger son had looked at the plain, practical sister instead of her. I did not weep, and I did not rage. A cold, heavy clarity settled deep into my bones. I took the folio, stood up, and walked out of the west. I found my sister in her private morning room in the main house. The space was beautiful, stuffed with expensive French silks, porcelain, and silver. A room built entirely of the wealth she had traded her soul to secure. She sat by the fire, a cup of chocolate in her hand, looking every bit the grand aristocratic lady she had always wanted to be. When I entered without knocking, her pleasant, pitying smile began to form. But it died the moment I dropped the folio into her lap. The silver spoon clinked sharply against her porcelain cup. Sibylla looked down at the faded leather, her sharp face draining of all color, her lips parting in a silent, suffocating gasp. "Amabel," she stammered, her voice losing its melodic pitch, sounding thin and brittle. This is old rubbish. I do not know what you think you have found." "I found 20 years, Sibylla," I said. My voice came out flat, level, sounding like a judge passing a final sentence in a windowless courtroom. "I found the winters I spent scrubbing grease from Workhouse stone, and I found the battles Gideon fought because he wanted to die. I found every lie you drafted on this parchment while you were planning your own grand wedding." Sibylla scrambled to her feet, the folio falling to the Persian rug, spilling the practice signatures at her feet. "You cannot prove anything to the county. If you tell Gideon, if you ruin my name, I will take Cressida away. I will ensure she never sees a farthing of her inheritance." I stepped closer, looking down at her. For 20 years, I had feared her sharp tongue and her wealth. Now, looking at her frantic, terrified eyes, I felt nothing but a deep, heavy mercy that felt colder than hatred. "I am not going to tell the county, Sibylla," I said quietly, my rough hand brushing the silk of her sleeve. "And I am not going to ruin you. If I publicize your malice, Gideon will dismantle your life, and Cressida will bear the shame of a monster for a mother. I will not let your poison touch that girl's future." Sibylla blinked, a desperate, ugly relief flooding her face. "Then, you will keep silent." "I will," I whispered, leaning in until she could smell the lye soap that still clung to my fingers. "But you will live in this grand house, knowing that every luxury you possess was bought with a theft. You will look at Gideon, and you will look at me, and you will know that you failed to break us. I am leaving you to the architecture of your own mind, sister, and that is a prison far darker than the one you built for me." I turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone among her expensive, silent silver, shivering in the heat of her own fire. The estate room was perfectly quiet when I returned. The afternoon sun had finally broken through the lingering fog, casting long, pale shafts of light across the old oak desk. The faded leather folio lay open in my hands, its secrets spent, the heavy burden of 20 years finally lifting from my chest. I didn't feel the burning rage that had kept me warm in the workhouse. I felt a vast, clean emptiness. I was no longer a prisoner, and I was no longer a victim. I was simply myself. A shadow fell across the ledger pages. Gideon stood in the doorway, his heavy wooled coat discarded, his linen shirt open at the throat. He looked at the folio in my hands, then up at my face, his severe gray eyes reading the truth in my silence before I could even speak a word. "You found the hand that signed it," he said, his low, gravelly voice steady. though a dangerous vein throbbed against his jaw. I did, I answered, closing the folio with a gentle final click. I set it on the corner of the desk. And it is settled, Gideon. The letters will stay in the dark where they belong. It was a malice born of an old envy, and the cost of exposing it would fall on Cressida's shoulders, not the guilty. I will not let the past bleed the only innocent soul in this family. Gideon walked slowly across the room, his boots echoing softly against the floorboards. He stopped at the edge of the desk, looking down at me. The harsh, military stillness that usually governed his features seemed to break, revealing the raw, aching vulnerability of the boy who had loved me under the orchard trees. "You always had a heavier mercy than the rest of the world, Amabel," he whispered. He reached across the mahogany, his large, scarred hand flattening against the open page of the ledger. "The land agent is gone. My cousin Perry has retreated to London to lick his wounds. The accounts are clear, and the gates are open. You are a free woman. You owe this estate nothing, and you owe me nothing." I looked down at his hand, then up into his eyes. "Is that why you brought me here, my lord? To clear a balance. I brought you here because I was a fool who believed a lie," Gideon said, his voice cracking with a sudden, fierce intensity. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between us, until I could feel the heat of him in the cold room. "I don't want an alliance of convenience to satisfy the county, and I don't need a grand name to secure my position. I want the woman who stood against the storm. I want the partner who knows how to hold the ground when the world goes mad. Amabel, I cannot give you back the 20 years we lost, but I can give you every winter I have left, not as a rescue, as a choice." I looked at my rough, chapped fingers, then I reached out and placed my hand directly into his broad, calloused palm. For 5 years, I had survived by relying entirely on my own strength. I didn't need his grand house, and I didn't need his Marquess's gold to make me whole. I was already sufficient. And it was from that place of absolute sufficiency that I finally let the defensive walls tumble down. "It is a choice, Gideon," I whispered, a small, genuine smile finally breaking the severe lines of my own face. "The arithmetic is done. The ledger is closed. We were married 3 weeks later, not in a grand London cathedral to satisfy society, but in the small parish church at the edge of Low Barrow, with only Cressida standing witness. The winter frost had turned the northern hills into a quiet sea of white, but the hearth in the west wing burned hot and bright. That evening, as the snow began to fall softly against the high sash windows, we sat side by side at the massive oak desk. There were no more old debts to track, no more malicious ghosts lingering in the corners. There was only the steady scratch of the quill, the rustle of new parchment, and 2 graying heads bent together over the ledger of a new life, finally balancing the account in the gold evening light. If this story has you hooked, if you can feel that slow, gripping tension, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys unforgettable storytelling. New stories drop every day, each one more intense than the last. And before you leave, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's part of this journey. We may be wrapping up here, but the drama doesn't end. If your pulse is still racing, keep it going. The next 2 stories on your screen go even deeper, darker, bolder, impossible to ignore. Subscribe so we stay connected. Then pick one and dive in. Your next obsession is just 1 click away.